Well, our next speaker has had quite a varied career. He started his business career copying pirated music. He went on to comedy. Now he's an international comedy star. He hosts an Emmy-winning TV show. He's got a fantastic #1 best-selling book. He speaks 8 languages, so kind of an underachiever. But I'm a huge fan of his. I read the book. It's funny and insightful, but also very profound, telling his own story and other people's stories. He's encouraging people around the world to expand their circles of giving, so I'm excited to welcome Trevor Noah.
Thank you again, Bill and Melinda, for having me here. Good morning/afternoon, everybody. Good to have you. This is weird because I'm just going to talk to your phones and we're right here. It's a strange experience. Welcome to the millennial age. Yeah, you'll have the picture and you'll show it to your friend and they'll go, "What did he look like in person?" You go, "I don't know. I was also looking at my phone when I showed it, when I should have been there with him." First of all, thank you very much, Bill and Melinda, for having me. When I was first asked to be here, they said, "Hey, we want you to come and speak at this event, goalkeepers, and talk about what's happening in the world." And I looked through all of the people who were speaking, and I said, "But I have nothing. I do not have a fridge that can change lives. I do not have a plan to eradicate HIV in South Africa and in Southern Africa and the rest of the continent. And I most definitely cannot ride a motorbike, so I don't know what I can do for you." Bill just said, just come and share your thoughts, your stories, your ideas. And I guess that's how I process information. That's how I process my world. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself and why goalkeepers mean so much to me. So in case you don't know me, my name is Trevor Noah. I grew up in South Africa during a time known as apartheid. And for those who don't know, apartheid was a system of laws which made it illegal for black people and white people to integrate with each other, amongst other things. Black people lived in separate areas to white people. They had different rules. They were segregated. And this was particularly tough for me because I grew up in a mixed family, right? Well, with me being the mixed one in the family. My mother's a black woman, Xhosa woman from South Africa. And in case you're wondering, Xhosa is one of the languages with the clicks in it. Xhosa, right? Xhosa. But not like in American movies. I've seen those movies where they have the Africans and they're like, "No, no, 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 no." That's not a language, all right? No, even we watch those movies and we're like, "I wonder what they're saying, eh?" It's not a language. But my mother's a Xhosa woman, South African. My father's Swiss, from Switzerland, and was a white man, and so, well, still is a white man. He didn't change. And so they got together during this time, which was against the law, and they had me. And, it wasn't easy growing up in this family, and that's really where our journey began. Because we were a family that couldn't be together. We were a family that was, for all intents and purposes, a crime that existed. Me being born from my mother, because of my father, was me being born on a crime. And, one of the biggest things I connected with when, reading about goalkeepers and learning about the organization was the optimism, was the ability to see what no one could see at a time when no one should almost have the right to see it. My mother was one of those people. My mother's a beautiful, powerful woman who endured a lot during her life. We lived through apartheid in South Africa. We lived through her going on to marry a man who was extremely abusive and alcoholic. And throughout all of that, the one thing that I always admired in my mom was that she had the ability to appreciate the reality of the world she was in, but also optimistically pursue the future that she wished to exist in. And that's for me what Goalkeepers is all about, optimism. People always ask, they go, is the world going to be in a better place? Is the world getting better or is it getting worse? Now, depending on who you ask, there will always be a different answer. I've come to find one of the reasons I believe the world is getting better is because we have access to information on how bad the world actually is, which I know is a strange thing to say, but that's honestly what I believe. As a young person, and as someone who makes a show for young people, one of the most powerful tools I've realized is information. We come from an age where there was misinformation, disinformation, and there is some of it today. But now, more than ever, young people communicate across borders, across continents. You see people in England and in America and South Africa tweeting, talking to people in Myanmar. You see people speaking out about what they see happening in Sudan. You see people commiserating and sharing with victims of hurricanes across the Caribbean or across Texas. And whenever I look at that, I go, it's one of the most powerful tools that, if harnessed correctly, can lead to a completely new way that we communicate and we change the world. And young people are driven. That's one of the most beautiful things I've realized, is we live in a new age. Millennials oftentimes are mocked. They say they're lazy, they believe that they're entitled, and they cry about small things, which is true, but they're also driven. They also wish to make a change. They also believe that they can make a change. And I believe that information and these tools that we possess today have helped increase that. More than ever, we see that in America. As the host of The Daily Show, I'm obviously in a world where we comment on news and politics. And one thing I've noticed with my audience is not only are young people growing into the world of politics, but they're engaged in a way that people were never engaged before, engaged in a way where they understand that they can actually change the course of history as opposed to just being a part of it. It's a beautiful experience to see that's taking place across continents. In my home country, South Africa, we see the same thing. Young people standing up and saying, we don't accept the status quo. We can change our destiny. We can change the future. We can be a part of this world. And essentially, that's what's happening in America right now. You feel it. People always come up to me and they go, Trevor, as the host of The Daily Show, how do you feel about Donald Trump? And I say, well, I don't know how to feel about him. That's the honest truth. He's a paradox for me emotionally. One part of me is terrified at the notion that he is president of the most powerful nation in the world. The other side of me knows that every day he's going to make me laugh. I cannot deny this. The best way I can put it is, it's almost like there's a giant asteroid headed towards the Earth, but it's shaped like a penis. I think I'm going to die, but I know I'm going to laugh. And this is a tough place to be in, because you have to process the very real situation that you are in, and that is a dangerous one. But at the same time, you can acknowledge that when you laugh, you're not controlled by fear. And that's something that I've always lived with in my life, in my family. My mother always said to me, she said, when we're laughing, we're not afraid. When we are laughing, we are experiencing our truest selves. It doesn't mean what is happening to us is not real, but it means that we can process the very real world that is happening to us. And in many ways, I try and look at the positives. People go, is the world getting better? I go, I believe it's always getting better, but in many ways, the world is like the body. You cannot see the change when you look at it every single day, but if you take snapshots, you can see how things are getting better. You can also see how some things are getting worse. Climate change is one of those, and that's where young people are stepping up and saying, hey, hurricanes are a great example. The intensity of these once-in-a-lifetime events has increased. Maybe it's time to do something. Young people are speaking up. Donald Trump is doing that. People are speaking up. They're engaging like never before. For the first time in history, we're living through a time period where we're learning about the presidency at the same time as the president, which is engaging people like never before. You wake up, you read the newspaper, and you go, I've never knew this before. And somewhere at that exact same moment, the president is reading that same newspaper, saying the exact same thing. And that for me is exciting. Is it scary? Yes. But most exciting things are scary. But honestly, I saw it over the last few weeks, and I mean, it's still unfolding now. You have, Hurricane Maria, which is wreaking havoc and moving, to Puerto Rico now, and we're seeing the devastation. But we've also seen the giving. I was touched by how many people, even on our show, reached out. And there is an opportunity for everyone to become a goalkeeper, which is what excites me. And that is, in this new world of technology, we have the opportunity to engage with activists on the ground level. People often mock millennials and they say these are hashtag activists. And I argue they're hashtag activists until they're given the opportunity to take it from a tweet into the streets. And so I urge every single one of you in this room, if you have the power, if you have the ability, if you have the information or the knowledge, take these people up on what they're offering. They're energized, they're optimistic, they're powerful beyond all measure, and I'm proud to say that I'm one of them. I'm a millennial, and by proxy, I hope to be a goalkeeper. Thank you very much for having me, and congratulations on everything today.
Well, we get now to the fourth and final thing that makes me excited about where we're going, and this is allies in action. Foundations, corporations, governments, and individuals working together. We've heard about a few of these kind of new partnerships with the accelerators that were announced today. And now I get to announce our final speaker. Barack Obama has dedicated his career to helping people improve their lives. First as a community organizer, then as a state senator, a U.S. senator, and then, of course, as the 44th President of the United States. I got to meet with President Obama a number of times, and I was always impressed by how he wasn't discouraged, even when tough challenges came along. He stayed focused on the work. He did what he could to make positive change. And now he's continuing that incredible commitment with the Obama Foundation. Please welcome former President Barack Obama.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, please, everybody have a seat. Have a seat. We got work to do here. Thank you, Bill, for that introduction. More importantly, thank you and Melinda for your tireless efforts towards making a better world. I've been reading about these goalkeepers. You guys are pretty inspirational. And I am excited to be here with you. And whether it's girls' education or global health or climate change, you're setting a standard for the sorts of innovation and persistence and activism that the world desperately needs right now. So I could not be prouder. And that's really what I'm going to talk about very briefly before I have a chance for a discussion with Bill and Melinda. I want to talk about changing the world. I remember sitting down with Bill in Paris a couple of years ago, where the world was coming together to hammer out an agreement, a small agreement to save the planet, by taking meaningful action to tackle climate change. It's a threat that may define the contours of this century more than just about anything else. Here was the interesting thing. Bill saw this not simply as a challenge, but also as an opportunity. And I remember him in sort of a matter-of-fact way saying, well, we're going to just have to go ahead and invent some new technologies. Which I said, I agree, let's do that. Although he knows more than me about inventing new technologies. But his tone was, yes, this is hard, but we can figure it out. It's hard, but it can be done. And that spirit, a spirit that says, to quote, I guess myself, yes, we can, rather than that spirit, rather than a spirit of despair, is the motor by which we've been able to see real progress in reducing the pace of carbon emission increases here in the U.S. And even if at the current moment the federal government is not as engaged in these efforts as I would like, nevertheless, progress continues because of the efforts of people like Bill and a whole host of entrepreneurs and universities and cities and states. They are making change around energy policy in America, separate and apart from what government is doing. And that gives me confidence that we can continue to make progress. And my broader point here is that you tend to believe when Bill says we can do something, that we can do it. And when all of you stand up and say, this is something we can do, that spirit is infectious. And it's exactly what we need right now. We do face extraordinary challenges. You've heard of many of them in your discussions today. You know the nature of these challenges from your work. Growing economic inequality, a changing climate, terrorism, mass migration, still too much extreme poverty, still too many girls who are denied an education, the rise of nationalism and xenophobia, and a politics that says it's not we, but us and them, a politics that threatens to turn good people away from the kind of collective action that has always driven human progress. So these are real challenges, and we can't sugarcoat them. They're going to take a long time to solve. But that can't discourage any of us from the belief that individually and collectively, we can make a difference. We can make things better. And rather than be daunted by those challenges should inspire us and excite us, because it gives us an opportunity to make our mark on the world in ways that we haven't even yet scratched the surface of. We have to reject the notion that we're suddenly gripped by forces that we cannot control. We've got to embrace the longer and more optimistic view of history and the part that we play in it. And if you are skeptical of such optimism, I will say something that may sound controversial. I used to say this to my staff in the White House, young interns who would come in, any group of young people that I met with, and that is that by just about every measure, America is better and the world is better than it was 50 years ago, 30 years ago, or even 10 years ago. And I know that statement doesn't jibe with the steady stream of bad news and cynicism that we're fed through television and Twitter, but think about it. I was born, I know I have gray hair, but I don't consider myself that old. But I was born at a time when women and people of color were systematically, routinely excluded from enormous portions of American life. Today, women and minorities have risen up the ranks of business and politics and everywhere else. And even if we still have miles to travel and innumerable laws and hearts and minds to change, the shift in what this country is and what it means is astonishing, remarkable, and it's happened when you measure it against the scope of human history in an instant. Just since I graduated from college, crime rates, teen birth rates, dropout rates, the share of people living in poverty have dropped, and in some cases dropped dramatically. The share of Americans with college education is up, despite a massive global recession. In the final years of my presidency, the uninsured rate reached a new low. Median household income reached a new high. That's here in the United States. Worldwide, our progress is even more remarkable. And Bill can rattle off these statistics better than I can. But over the past 100 years, we've come from a world where only a small fraction of women could vote to a world where almost every woman can. Since the 1950s, the global average life expectancy has grown by more than 20 years. Since 1990, we have cut extreme poverty and childhood mortality in half. Keep in mind, I was in law school in 1990. It seems like yesterday. Since 2000, we've evolved from a world without marriage equality to one where it's a reality in more than 24 countries. All of this has happened in such a steady march that sometimes we have a tendency to take it for granted. But I often ask when I meet with young people, if you had to choose any moment in history in which to be born, and you didn't know in advance whether you were going to be male or female, what country you were going to be from, what your status was, you'd choose right now, because the world has never been healthier or wealthier or better educated or in many ways more tolerant or less violent than it is today. Fewer people are dying young. More people are living not only longer but better. More girls are in school. More adults can read. More children get the vaccines that they need. Despite the enormous conflicts that break our hearts around the world, it's demonstrable that fewer people are being killed in wars and conflicts than ever before. This would be the time you'd want to be, showing up on this planet. And these trends are real. They do not make us complacent, but they should spur us to action, because it shows, despite the naysayers and the cynicism, that in fact change can happen. They're not the result of mysterious forces of chance. They happen because countless people, like you, toiling for many years, chose to make this progress. Some, like Bill and Melinda, have enormous wealth and influence. Others, like Justin Trudeau, who I know addressed you earlier, have formal political offices. But the majority of people who made these advances were citizens, doctors, nurses, entrepreneurs, clergy, moms, community leaders, activists, union leaders, who mobilized and organized and voted and innovated and pushed for change. And by the way, they knew at every step of the way that they would not get everything they wanted as fast as they wanted. They knew that progress required struggle and perseverance and discipline and faith. They knew that sometimes for every 2 steps forward, you'll take a step back. But they made things better. And this is something I always had to emphasize to my staff when I was president. Better is good. You laugh, but sometimes people forget that. I will take better every time. So that's what's needed today. The engagement of everyone who wants to see a better future for our children. And it can be frustrating. I'll take an example here in the United States. Over the past 8 years, thousands upon thousands of Americans threw themselves into the collective effort of reforming our healthcare system. Those of you who live in countries that already have universal health care are trying to figure out what's the controversy here. I am too. These people, but you know, the folks who did the work, it wasn't just policy wonks, it wasn't just politicians. It was moms and dads, people who had the experience of a sick child or crushing medical bills that threatened to bankrupt them. Maybe a parent who was lost to cancer that, had that person got a regular checkup, might have been caught earlier. And those voices from every walk of life in every corner of the country, against all odds, made a difference. And for the first time, more than 90% of Americans know the security of health insurance. Paying more for insurance or being denied insurance because of a pre-existing condition or because you are a woman, that's not a thing anymore. We got rid of that. And people are alive today because of it, and that's progress. Now, the legislation that we passed was full of things that still need to be fixed. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. And so when I see people trying to undo that hard-won progress for the 50th or 60th time, with bills that would raise costs or reduce coverage, or roll back protections for older Americans or people with pre-existing conditions, the cancer survivor, the expecting mom, or the child with autism, or asthma, for whom coverage, once again, would be almost unattainable. It is aggravating. And all of this being done without any demonstrable economic or actuarial or plain common sense rationale, it frustrates. And it's certainly frustrating to have to mobilize every couple of months to keep our leaders from inflicting real human suffering on our constituents. But, typically that's how progress is won and how progress is maintained on every issue. We have to stand up for each other, recognize that progress is never inevitable, that it often can be fragile, it's in need of constant renewal, and our individual progress and our collective progress depends on our willingness to roll up our sleeves and work. And not be afraid to work. So, in conclusion, each of us can make a difference, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here because otherwise you wouldn't be a goalkeeper. But many of you are young and maybe have only seen forward momentum and may not have seen backward momentum yet. Many of you may confront hurdles and roadblocks and disappointments in the future. And when that happens, that's the test. The test is not how do you feel when things are going good or when you are at a cool conference in New York with Bill and Melinda Gates and Will I Am. Right? The test is when you're in the field and you're on the ground and you are doing work and people are resisting or misunderstanding or purposely undermining efforts that you know can make a difference, and how do you respond to that? And what I'm suggesting here today is that your response has to be to reject cynicism and reject pessimism and push forward with a certain infectious and relentless optimism. Not blind optimism, not one that ignores the scale and the scope of challenges, but that hard-earned optimism that's rooted in the stories of very real progress that have occurred throughout human history. And the recognition that our successes, even though sometimes they're small or incomplete, accumulate, they build, and they create a trajectory that's better and will mean some girl somewhere getting an education that otherwise she wouldn't have had. That'll mean some farmer being able to cultivate a crop to feed his family and, if enough of them do it, feed a nation. That's what you're fighting for at every moment. Because each new generation stands on the successes of the previous generation. It's like a relay race that we're running. Each generation reaches up, standing on that previous generation, and bends that arc of history in the direction of more freedom and more opportunity and more justice. That's why I spend so much time when I was president convening young leaders on every continent that I visited. That's why in my post-presidency, my emphasis is going to be on training the next generation of leaders to take their own crack at changing the world through the Obama Foundation, which will be based in Chicago, but will have projects and programs and digital networks all across the globe. And I'm hoping I get a chance to work with some of you because I have great faith in you, just as I know Bill and Melinda have great faith in you. And I'm certain that if you keep pushing forward, then America and the world are going to be just fine. Thank you very much. You have some theme music here. That's good.
Those were incredibly inspiring remarks, I think, for all of us. And
Rob, she's using her
one of the
Rob.
things that strikes me in the conversations we've had in this room today, as you know earlier, as you said, Prime Minister Justin
I
Trudeau
said it
was
when
here.
I came back here, bro. I
And-
said it when I came back here.
You know, he started with youth movements in his own country and rose to be the prime minister. You started as a community organizer and rose to be president. You understand the power of moving people along, even people who aren't necessarily on your bus when you start. Talk to us a little bit about how you think of movements around the world and the power of those now, and what leaders can learn from them.
Well, I'd make a couple of observations. Number one is that most big change, most human progress is driven by young people who don't know any better and figure, why can't we do something different? Old people get comfortable or cranky or protective of their status or set in their ways. There's a reason why, if you look at, for example, here in the United States, the civil rights movement, the leaders of those movements were in their 20s. Dr. King was 26 when he started, 39 when he was killed. And if you canvass the world, oftentimes that is the impetus. People asking in ways that I think are familiar to many, not why not, but or not why, but why not? Why do things have to be the way they are? So that's point number one, that young people, I think, can make an enormous difference. Number two is that because most of us now either live in democracies or countries that purport to be democracies, because we have won the battle of ideas that says governments and our common efforts have to be rooted in the legitimacy of people. There is more power than ever in people being able to band together and collectively push for initiatives that are going to make change in their lives. That's something that for most of human history was unimaginable. That is one of the amazing transitions that has taken place, and you will notice that even in autocracies today, there is at least the pretense of democracy, because people believe that governments that are rooted in people are more legitimate. And that's a battle we won and now have to make real wherever we can. That's point number two. Point number three is simple math. In most places, if you want to get something done, whether it's a smarter climate change policy or health care for people or more funding for girls' education, you've got to have a majority of people supporting it. You got to have votes. You have to have the allocation of resources. And that requires mobilization and a game of addition rather than subtraction. So, and the fourth point I would make would be the internet now has turbocharged the capacity for us to develop movements in ways that we had not imagined before. Now, the last thing I'll say, so that I don't sound like I'm still in the U.S. Senate and filibustering, is I guess a smaller point, but a profound one that I tried to reinforce with my staff at every level of my public work and continue to do to this day. I actually think organizing, mobilizing, starting movements starts with a story. And you can't create a story that moves large numbers of people unless you are able to listen and hear to the story of the person next to you. The story of your neighbors, the stories of your coworkers, the stories of your community, the story of people who are not like you. And so one of the things that I think is important is for us to learn how to listen to each other and learn how it is that we came to be who we are, think the way we do, because that understanding of other people's stories is how you end up ultimately forging bonds and creating the glue that creates movements. Every great movement, you think about Gandhi in India, it started with his understanding of India's story and his own story, and seeing Indians in South Africa discriminated against, and recognizing that there were traditions and myths and a power in those stories that ended up driving out the most powerful empire on earth. It wasn't guns. And increasingly that will be the case, and certainly that will be the case if we want to move forward the sustainable development goals that we're talking about. Is we've got to be able to tell a story not only to big donors or politicians, but also to, for example, people here in the United States who may feel like, look, I've got my own problems, why should I be worrying about somebody on the other side of the world?
Yeah, I have to say, when we got into philanthropy and particularly studied global health, we were stunned at the progress. We'd had no idea. And it's kind of amazing if you ask even very well-educated people, what's happened with vaccination, what's happened with HIV. They don't know the positive story. And a little bit the news is always going to focus on the setbacks, because that's what happened that day. The gradual progress doesn't fit that paradigm. And even people who raise money for these causes, I have to say, sometimes even some of the material we create is talking about the piece that remains as though it's never improved. Do you have any thoughts on how we get this more positive sense of progress going, and how we would get that word out?
Well, look, you're talking to somebody who for 7 years tried to get the word out that things were going pretty good, and nobody, at least about 40% of the country, didn't believe me until I was gone, and then suddenly they believed it and they said things are great. So with that caveat, I'd make a couple observations. One, you're right, Bill, there is the nature of the media, and maybe just the human brain, is to fasten on what's wrong, not on what's right. And I'm not sure we're going to be able to change that, right? Visual displays of a fire are much more interesting than just a building sitting there. And so the fire is going to make the news. The building sitting there nicely and people are walking their dogs in front of it and stuff, that will not make the news. So I don't think that we can count on conventional media necessarily to spread the word. This is, though, where the power of the internet has not, I think, been harnessed the way it needs to be, particularly when we think about young people and young audiences. Malia and Sasha consume information differently than I do. And I think that those of us who've been involved with policy work are still putting out these reports with pie charts and this and that, and that's not interesting to them. But stories and visual representations of progress can go viral. There's a hunger for it. It's just that we don't systematically think about it. And so I think when the three of us were talking a while back, I mentioned that one of the areas that I'm deeply interested in is how do we build sort of a digital platform whereby people can go to find out what's happening that is moving the progress on issues and then activates them. Because I heard somebody, I think it was maybe Trevor, saying an important point. I'm very interested in how online communities can move offline. How this incredible power to convene through hashtags and tweets and this and that and the other eventually leads to people meeting each other and talking to each other. And I think that we have not fully tapped that as a way of spreading the word about progress that has been made. I also think it is important for us to put some friendly pressure on leaders to tell good stories and to make sure that we don't, that we aren't so rigid in our partisanship or ideologies that we are not willing to acknowledge and share when somebody who might be of a different political persuasion has done something really good, even if it runs contrary to our short-term political interests. I mean, I always used to say, as big as the differences were between me and my predecessor, George W. Bush, that what his administration initiated with PEPFAR was a singularly important achievement that we needed to sustain and build on. And I didn't think that somehow detracted from me to say that somebody from another political party did something really smart and really good and deserved credit for it. And I feel as if these days, within our political circles, that's a hard thing for people to bring themselves to do.
One of the things that Bill and I had the great privilege of doing when you were in the White House late in your presidency was spending a little bit of casual time on a Saturday night. And your daughters were in and out of your home, Lily and Sasha. And you've been to our house earlier this summer and saw Rory and Phoebe, two of our three, in and out of our house. Our daughter Jen is here in the front row. Tell me about...
Jen's like, thanks, Mom.
Yeah, sorry. You weren't home that night.
Jeez.
But she's about the age of
That's
your
our
daughters.
job, to embarrass you.
Exactly.
That's what we do.
I just did it. Job done right there. But, you know, Jen's about the age of your girls, a little bit older, but how have you and Michelle thought about talking to your children about being leaders in the world and taking up this mantle of what needs to be done in the world?
Well, what we've tried to communicate their entire lives is that each of us has responsibilities. When they were small, the responsibilities were small. Like, say when you want to go potty. And then, as you get older, your responsibilities grow. But part of what we, I think, try to communicate is that being responsible is an enormous privilege. That's what marks you as a fully grown human, is that other people rely on you, that you have influence, that you can make your mark, that if you do something well, that will improve other people's lives, that the kinds of values that we've tried to instill, many of them your basic homespun values like kindness and consideration and empathy and hard work, that those are tools by which you can shape the world around you in a way that feels good. And so what we've tried to encourage is that the sense that it's not somebody else's job, it's your job. And I think that's an ethic that they've embraced. Now, they will choose to participate in different ways because they have different temperaments, different strengths. I think one of the mistakes that we sometimes make is to think that there's just one way of making a difference or being involved. You know, if you are a brilliant engineer, you don't have to make a speech. You can create an app that allows an amplification or the scaling up of something that is really powerful. If you are somebody who likes to care for people, you don't have to go out and lead the protest march. You can mentor some kids or work at a local health clinic that is going to make a difference. So there are a lot of different ways in which to make a contribution, and we try to emphasize that to them as well. And then the third thing that we try to encourage is what I mentioned in my earlier remarks, which is that you have to be persistent. I always tell people that my early work as a community organizer in Chicago taught me an incredible amount, but I didn't set the world on fire. You know, I got some public parks for communities that needed them. I started some after-school programs. We helped set up a job training program for people who had been laid off of work, but those communities weren't suddenly transformed. They still had huge problems. But I took that experience and then I was able to build on it. And I think so often we get impatient because change does not look as if, sometimes it's not as discernible or immediate or impactful as we had imagined in our minds. And we get disappointed and we get frustrated. And for me, by the way, that's advice in life and not just in social change. I assume occasionally there was a bug in the software build.
Every now and then.
Every once in a while, you know, and we got to patch it again. This is annoying. But that's how. That's how.
I heard it
that's
a
how.
little
That's how
differently
stuff
than
happens.
that.
I wasn't known for my patience.
Yeah.
I didn't hear, oh darn. Bill, did you have one last question?
Yeah. So this week, part of the reason we're all in New York is the United Nations is meeting, and you know, so many of these global institutions that were created right after World War II, World Bank, World Health Organization, UNICEF, they've been key partners for many of these causes, and yet there is definitely a cynicism about their bureaucracy, their efficiency, and their ability to change. In fact, with very few exceptions like Global Fund and Gavi, we haven't had any new ones. So over the next 10 or 20 years, do you think these global institutions in terms of reform or creating new ones for pandemics and climate change, can they step up to play the role we need them to play?
Well, let me first of all say that the biggest problems we confront, no one nation is going to be able to solve on its own, not even a nation as powerful as the United States of America. There are times during my presidency where I was attacked for not claiming that we could go on our own, as if that was an expression of weakness. No, I believe that the United States is, in fact, an indispensable nation, and that many of the initiatives and much of the progress that we've made could not have been done unless we underwrote those efforts. And I'll use as an example our handling of Ebola, which in retrospect, I think a lot of historians would argue, was one of the, if not the most effective emergency public health intervention in history. We had to create the architecture and the infrastructure and send our military in to create runways where the Chinese could then land planes to deliver goods. And we had to provide guarantees to the Europeans so that if they sent health workers, they could feel some assurance that they could be medevaced out if they got infected. So I take great pride in what the United States can do, but if we're talking about climate change or global migration spurred on by drought or famine or ethnic conflicts, we're not going to be able to solve those things by ourselves. And as you indicated, Bill, if we get an airborne pandemic, unlike a slow-moving, disease that's difficult to transmit like Ebola, if we haven't built ahead of time some structures to deal with this, millions of people could be adversely impacted. So number one, you have to start with the premise and believe that multilateral institutions and efforts are important. And you don't have to cede all your sovereignty, or it doesn't make you less patriotic to believe that. You just have to have some sense and read. So that's point number one. Point number two is that, in fact, there are problems with existing multilateral institutions. Not surprisingly, they were designed post-World War II for the most part, and they couldn't have anticipated everything that's happened. There is bureaucracy and inertia and resistance to reform. So it is important for every country, every leader, to be honest about the need for reform and not simply think narrowly about, well, I want to keep certain numbers of slots or votes or this or that. At least on many of the issues where there shouldn't be a big ideological controversy. Look, reforming the Security Council, that's something that goes to core geopolitical interests and is a huge, difficult, and perhaps unachievable goal anytime soon. On the other hand, making sure that the WHO works well and that we have a sufficient security trigger when a pandemic or something else happens, that is achievable. And it shouldn't be controversial. It's just a matter of digging in and getting the work done. When it comes to girls' education, there may be cultural resistance in some places to actually getting it done, but generally speaking, there aren't that many folks who will explicitly say, I'm sorry, we don't want to educate our girls and women. As a practical matter, you may see that in certain countries, but at the level of our multilateral institutions, there should be a broad consensus. And so what I would hope for is that we come up with concrete plans in those areas, oftentimes with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals, are areas where there is a consensus on at least the aims, if not always the means. And think about how can we improve delivery systems, how can we improve their operations on a day-to-day basis. But ultimately, the last point I would make, that requires leaders to feel as if it matters and is important. That in turn requires the public think that it matters and is important, because unfortunately what you discover is that most politicians and elected leaders are followers and not leaders. They're called leaders, but most of the time they follow. They see what do their constituencies care about, and they respond. And one of the biggest challenges that we've had is that, and I speak most intimately about the United States, the general public responds with enormous generosity when they see a specific story of a child who's hungry, or somebody who's been stricken by a flood. But when it comes to just a general knowledge or interest in development funding, not only do they not know much, but they oftentimes have a negative reaction, because their view is, we've got a lot of needs here at home, why are we sending money overseas? Sadly, it is one of the only areas where Democrats and Republicans agree in the United States is on foreign aid. And repeatedly you've seen public opinion surveys where people wildly overestimate what we spend on foreign aid. They think 25% of the federal budget is going to foreign aid and helping people other than folks in their towns and their communities. So the need for public education in the ways we talked about, that promote, that tell a good story, that point out that this is actually a bargain, that connect what we do with respect to development to security, not in a perfect correlation, but to say that, look, if you've got failed states, then generally some of that's going to spill over on us. If you have economies that are failing, ironically, if you are concerned about immigration and mass migration, it's really a good investment to make countries work so that people can eat, because then it's not like they're dying to get on a dinghy and float across an ocean. If the country where they were born and they loved was functioning. So thinking about ways in which we describe this both as an economic imperative, an environmental imperative, a security imperative, the more we can influence public opinion, the more you'll see politicians respond. That doesn't mean that there is not an enormous role to play for NGOs, philanthropy, and so forth. But, and I've said this to both Bill and Melinda, even with the incredible generosity and enormous skill with which they've deployed their resources over the years, the U.S. budget's still bigger.
Absolutely. A lot bigger.
And,
a lot.
you know, this notion that you can, that I hear sometimes from young people, that you can work around government and work around politics because it's too messy, or it's corrupt, or it's, you know, I just don't like those folks, or what have you. I'm sorry, guys, that's not going to work. If you want to get done what you're talking about, you will have to combine effective philanthropy and technical know-how and you know, smart policy engineering with getting your hands dirty, trying to change public opinion and trying to ensure that the people who are in charge of the levers of power are responsive. And that will require work, and I guarantee you, you will be disappointed at points. But what a glorious thing it is to be responsible for saving the world. That's your responsibility. And Arn, thanks.
Thank you so much.